From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm Mary Jane Deeb, Chief of the African and Middle East Division, and I'm really delighted to welcome our partners here, the University of Maryland, and the best of all the best, the director of the Roshan Institute, and now the director of the language program at the University of Maryland, Dr. Fatima Keshavarz. She and the University of Maryland have been the partners with the Library of Congress of this extraordinary series of lectures, which have followed the opening of the exhibit on 1,000 years of the Persian book. And without them, this series would not have been possible. So I want to thank them for partnering with us. I'm also excited to have the partner, the husband of Dr. Fatima Keshavarz, professor of history at the University of Maryland, who has very graciously accepted to be part of this series and to share with us his thoughts and his work on the Persian book in pre-modern Turkey, but more of that later. I just want to say a few words about the African Middle East Division here. It's a division that is responsible for the collections from 78 countries, from the Middle East, from Africa, from Central Asia, from the Hebraic world. And this division is not only responsible for the collections, but also for making those collections known to the world. And we do that by bringing experts, as we have throughout this series, who talk about parts of the collections, the Persian book in this case, but also we have exhibits, symposia, programs that pull the reader to the collections, which are quite extraordinary in this library, in the Library of Congress, because the collections are not only in this reading room, in this division, but throughout the library. So someone doing a work on Persian history, for example, would be coming here for the books in the vernacular. However, they would go to the general collections for books in German or French or English or other languages, would go to the law library if they were interested in certain legal aspects, because the law library holds materials that are Persian but legal, and it would be in the law library. If they were interested in geography, they would go to the geography and map division. So it's across the board. So the collections, which are absolutely exceptional, are not only to be found in this division, but throughout the library. And I would like now to invite Dr. Keshavarz to say something about her own institution and the way it has partnered so well with us. Dr. Keshavarz.
Thank you so much, Mary Jane, for those gracious words. It has really been a wonderful partnership for us from the moment of creating the exhibition, which has other sources of funding, but nonetheless we were at the Roshan Institute and the University of Maryland closely involved as Hirad and his colleagues were putting this amazing exhibit together, which covers not just Iran and Persian as produced in present-day Iran, but on a much broader basis from the Persian-speaking world. We are all very grateful to Dr. Lahimir Jalali and the Roshan Cultural Heritage Institute for funding this particular speaker series, because we kept thinking that we really need some discussion, some talk about what is going on. And so these bi-weekly series have been really wonderful. So with that, I really basically want to thank you all for coming here, and thank the Library of Congress and Mary Jane, Hirad, Chris, who wasn't able to be here, Chris Murphy, because I believe he has a cold. And you guys have been an amazing partner, and we've done something that I was in the Iranian Studies Association meeting 2 days ago in Montreal, and everyone was talking about the exhibit and about the series. So thank you so much. Looking forward to present day presentation, and I think that Hirad would like to say a few words about the speaker and about the exhibit. Thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for coming. I am very glad to see you here. Thank you, Mary Jane, and thank you very much, Dr. Keshavarz. I'm very, very honored to be here in the presence of such wonderful distinguished scholars. And of course, I thank all the people who've taken time out of their busy schedule during lunch hour, which is not easy to do in DC, and come to Washington to be here. I would like to introduce our distinguished speaker today. Dr. Ahmet Karamustafa is a professor of history at the University of Maryland at College Park. His expertise is in the social and intellectual history of medieval and early modern Islam in the Middle East and South Asia, as well as in theory and method in the study of religion. He is the author of God's Unruly Friends, University of Utah Press, 1994, a book on ascetic movements in medieval Islam, and Wahidi's Menakib Hujja Jahan و Natijeh Jan, the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization, Harvard University, 1993, a study of 16th century mystical text in Ottoman Turkish. He also served as an editor for and wrote several articles in cartography in the traditional Islamic and South Asian societies, University of Chicago Press, 1992. More recently, he completed a comprehensive historical overview of early Islamic mysticism titled Sufism, the Formative Period, published simultaneously by Edinburgh University Press and University of California in 2007. Currently, he is at work on a sequel volume titled The Flowering of Sufism, as well as another book project, Vernacular Islam, Everyday Muslim Religious Life in Medieval Turkey. Dr. Karamustafa has held several administrative positions, including a 5-year term as a director of religious studies program at Washington University in St. Louis. He was the co-chair of the Study of Islam section at the American Academy of Religion between 2008 till 2011. Without taking any further time, I ask Dr. Karamustafa to Lutfan come up here and give us a wonderful lecture. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And let me start out. Okay, let me start out by following tradition and thanking the Library of Congress and our hosts, Mary Jane Deeb and her wonderful team. And it's a real pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. So the topic of my presentation today is really slightly more than what the title suggests. The title basically says the Persian book on pre-modern Turkey, but I hope also to give you some kind of a background in historical context in terms of the ways in which Persian and Turkish as linguistic and literary traditions, and broadly speaking cultural traditions, have been intertwined for close to a millennium. So with that in mind, let me just plunge in. Very quick survey of the territory that we're going to be covering. Essentially, modern Turkey obviously picks up the peninsula right here. This is Anatolia. But the territory that I'm going to be talking about is a slightly more expansive, perhaps going from the eastern coast of the Mediterranean into essentially the so-called Iranian part of Iraq. Iran, that was historically known as part of the Iranian cultural world as well as the Arabic cultural world after the Arab conquest in particular, and into western Iran and way into the Caucasus, into Georgia in particular. This is roughly the territory of the interaction that we will be concerned with. So, it's essentially western Iran, including the Azerbaijan of Iran and Azerbaijan of the Independent Republic, eastern Anatolia of present-day Turkey, the Persian Iraq, and the southern Caucasus, in particular Georgia, with some forays into the Balkans as well. As you will see, there are people who cultivated Persian in the Balkans, in southeast Europe of the Ottoman territories as well. This is a territory that has been populated by lots of different ethnic groups, minimal counting Arabs, Armenians, Caucasians, especially Georgians, as I pointed out, Kurds, Assyrians, and of course Turks, the topic of our talk. So it's a culturally and ethnically highly complex area over which the interaction of Persian and Turkish takes place. I will have two assumptions as I'm going through the talk. I just wanted to make those explicit with you. One is that I'm assuming, for the most part, that in the period that we're concerned with, which will be the past millennium, that there is a whole lot of cultural continuity in these territories, irrespective of the linguistic ethnic diversity that reigns, rather than ruptures. So that's one general assumption that I'm going to make. In other words, the fact that people spoke different languages, inhabited different territories, did not always and immediately lead to cultural ruptures or incommunication between these. We should rather assume the opposite is the sense. And then the second most important assumption, which is especially helpful for all of us who have been living in the era of the modern nation state and nationalism, that linguistic identity does not always coincide with ethnic identity. Namely, the fact that people write or in Persian, for instance, does not mean that they are ethnic Iranians or Persians, however you want to think of it. And the same applies to Turkish and all the other languages, actually, especially the ones that have lots of different registers, as I will get to. So this is probably the most complicated slide. I will cut it down, but I did want you to have a timetable. This is the detailed version and followed by a simplified version. The detailed version, I will start the coverage in late 11th century. Typically, for people who look into Turkish history, 1071, the year 1071 is a watershed event which is marked by a battle which somehow opens the gates of Anatolia to Turkic tribal groups, nomadic groups, and so I will pick up coverage from that point on. Late 11th and 12th centuries, we have various Muslim rulers and also non-Muslim rulers, of course, in central and eastern Anatolia. The first half of the 13th century is when most of Anatolia is united under the single rule of a Muslim Turkic dynasty, Seljuk dynasty. This is the continuation of the Iranian Seljuks. The second half of the 13th century, that is superseded by the fact that the Mongol rulers of Iran, who are known as Ilkhans, actually render Anatolia and former Seljuk territories into an annex of their own state, and this is the era of the Mongol protectorate, followed by a highly complicated couple centuries, 14th and 15th centuries, where we have lots of different perhaps 20 to 30 in number altogether over the course of 2 centuries, smaller states. We call them principalities. The scholarly custom has been to call them Turkmen. The term Turkmen here normally is used to refer to Muslim Oghuz Turks. Oghuz Turks are a Western tribal confederation of Turkic speakers for the most part. And it has been customary to refer to them as Turkmen as they began to Islamize and also rule as Muslim rulers. So 14th and 15th centuries, the political and cultural history is highly complex and fragmentary, and rather fragmented. Lots of different rulers of little towns and larger towns, and with their own particular courts. The scene begins to clear in terms of political history from the late 15th century onwards, with the ascendancy and then finally imperialization of the Ottomans. One of these principalities, the Ottomans, actually eventually secure the rule over Anatolia and beyond, and turn into a world empire beginning basically the mid-15th century and onwards. So late 15th century till World War I is Ottomans reign supreme in the area that we're concerned with for the most part, and then from 1923 onwards, with the establishment of the modern Turkish Republic, the coverage is complete. I will simplify this and turn it into Seljuk, 12th and 13th centuries, Turkmen realities, 14th and 15th centuries, Ottomans, 15th through the 19th centuries, and Republican, 20th century up until today. Let me now turn and make some comments about the ways in which Persian and Turkish have been intertwined over this time period in the territories that we just quickly reviewed. There is, of course, different levels of linguistic reality. The most common and the one that we're all at home with is that of the spoken language. So, of course, Persian as spoken language, Persian as the vernacular. The same thing applies to Turkish as well, but I will be talking from the perspective of Persian for now. However, there is also the fact that certain languages, and that certainly happened to Persian, are elevated, so to speak, from the level of spoken language to more specialized registers of linguistic usage. One of these, the first one, is whereby the Persian had turned into a language of politics, empire, administration, and broadly speaking, political culture. All of you here may know that this happened to Persian essentially starting from the 10th century of the Common Era, and the Persian arose as the second dominant political and also increasingly cultural language of Muslim rulers in Southwest Asia, broadly speaking. So by the time Turks actually enter this territory, again from the 10th century, Persian already meets them as an imperial language, which has an imperial culture and bolstered by such things as the Book of Kings, Shahnameh, which then is adapted by many others. Persian, however, essentially in the course of the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries also turns into a language of Islamic religion. So many Muslim religious scholars begin to cultivate Persian in addition to Arabic, and at times they switch over to Persian, especially for secular learning, by which I mean things such as astronomy, zoology, botany, basically timekeeping, any other kinds of history writing in particular. All these things begin to take place in Persian before the Turks arrive. And then, of course, perhaps the one that has been lasting value for the Turkish-Persian interaction, that is, Persian singles itself out as a language of literature in general, but of poetry in particular. So these three areas, Persian as imperial language or political language, Persian as language of Islam and secular learning, and Persian as language of literature, are going to basically have a long-lasting imprint in the ways in which Turkish language and literature and Turkish culture in the areas that we're concerned with develop over the course of this millennium. The main actors involved in this drama that we're looking at in the territories that we're covering, starting from Western Iran and moving to the West. First of all, there are going to be, throughout this period, lots of Persian-speaking migrants, emigres, and others, essentially, who are, for various reasons, moving westward from the geographical Iran to Anatolia specifically, and even beyond at times. They will include both native speakers and also bilinguals, and I want to point this out to you as a reality that, especially for those of us who are students of pre-modern Middle East, bilingualism is a rather common phenomenon, and sometimes we want to box people into Persian speakers and Turkish speakers, but there are people like my own children who are truly trilingual, for instance. So it's difficult to do that, but us historians meet them in action. So native speakers, but including bilinguals, and also there are others who clearly speak, the Persian speakers, who are not speakers of the vernacular, but have actually acquired these learned registers of the language. They are skillful administrators, they are skillful literateurs or poets and writers, they are skillful historians, and they cultivate that high register of Persian. And then we've got the second category of actors. These are cultural elites who are well versed in Persian cultural traditions, and they could come from a number of different ethnic backgrounds. They will include native speakers of languages other than Persian, so at a minimally Turks, Kurds, Armenians, Arabic speakers, Aramaic speakers, and so on and so forth. There are many people who will have picked up Persian along the way, not necessarily as their mother tongue, but as necessarily, quite often as the language that they acquire along the way as a part of their learning, as a part of their education and cultural refinement in general, for the most part. Persian will be spoken by them as a second or a third language, and sometimes Persian will not be spoken by them at the vernacular level at all, even though they will be extremely knowledgeable about Persian literary culture, for instance, and will be able to cite Persian poetry without being able to, let's say, actually say a few niceties in Persian in terms of colloquial conversation. So these are people who are cultivating Persian as language of culture. So let's now turn to our different eras, and I will try to take you through the different eras with these general parameters in mind and show you the ways in which the interaction between Persian and Turkish took place in these different periods. During the 12th and 13th centuries, the Seljuk era, as I designated it, you should remember that this is a newly Islamizing area. Non-Muslims form the majority everywhere. In fact, probably during these 2 centuries, they outnumber Muslims to the ratio of 10 to 1. We are talking of Greek speakers, Armenians in particular, and Kurds who have not yet become Muslims, and Georgians, and so on and so forth. In this period, Arabic and Persian basically are the languages of Islam, but also Islamic civilization, in the sense that if you want to do philosophy in this period, you certainly have to learn Arabic, or increasingly developed during the 12th century, Persian. You could do philosophy in Persian as well. Same thing applies to Islamic areas of learning, but also religiously speaking, but also secular areas of learning. This is also the era in Anatolia of emigres, sojourners, travelers from the Persian East. The events of these 2 centuries, I do not really have time to outline for you here. It's highly complicated. Most of you are, generally speaking, already familiar with one major event of this era, which caused lots of Persian speakers to move westward, and that's the Mongol invasions, especially from the early 13th century onwards, of Iran and Central Asia and Iran. But such events and other similar political and cultural developments led to many Persian emigres finding their way in. That we think during certainly the 13th century, all major cities of Anatolia harbored significant numbers of Persian speakers, after Greek or Armenian and Turkish, broadly speaking. So that if you were traveling around Turkey, quote unquote, today, instead of today, if you were traveling around during the 13th century as a Persian speaker, every time you go to, basically you would find significant numbers of Persian speakers, and then would have no difficulty essentially getting around or making yourself feel at home. In this era, in Anatolia, Persian is the language of politics, is the language of especially Sufi Islam, and is also the language of secular learning as well as poetry. Let me just remind you that the Seljuk Turkish rulers of Anatolia all essentially fashioned themselves after Iranian rulers, to the extent of actually taking names from the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, such as Keykavus and Keykavus and so on and so forth, and certainly cultivated Persian learning at the court, just as well as any other ruler of Iran, let's say, would have done. And in this era, we find the libraries in major cities, and I've listed some of the major cities of that era. Some of them are no longer major cities today, like Aksaray, Konya, Aksaray, Niğde, Kayseri, Ankara, Kırşehir, Tokat, Amasya, Sivas, Erzurum, Erzincan, Malatya. These are all historical cities which have a long history of basically Persian communities and Persian language and learning being cultivated in them, reflected today in Seljuk era architectural remains, monumental and otherwise, that are marked by Persian, essentially, not only in calligraphy, but also in artistic style and decoration. And we even know that in particular colleges of Islamic learning, the madrasas at the time, Persian was actually in use in many occasions when Arabic was not yet sufficiently well acquired by the students. Many actually resorted to the Persian to begin with. According to some circumstantial evidence, admittedly, that we have, it is possible for us to say that. So the summary of this is that in this period, there is, alongside Islamization and alongside major demographic movement of Turkish speakers into Anatolia, we also have a simultaneous Persianization of Anatolia at a significant level, not necessarily at the level of very high numbers of native speakers, but certainly sufficient numbers so that when, during the 13th century, again, you walk in the streets, you can certainly, I think, talk and shop in Persian for the most part. So, some examples, Seljuk examples. Earliest extant Persian work composed in Anatolia today is a work called Kashf al-Aqaba, the discovery of Aqaba is a presumably technical astronomical term, which I don't know what it means really. I looked it up but couldn't find it, so I should get in touch with an astronomer, historian of astronomy, colleague of mine. But it is composed by a certain Ilyas ibn Ahmed of Kayseriye, Kayseri today, dedicated to the ruler of the area, Kayseri and Sivas at the time, early 12th century, Emir Gazi Gümüştegin, a Turkish ruler by name, the founder, however, of a dynasty that has a Persian name, the Danishmendi dynasty. So these Danishmendis, for instance, were very active during the 12th century in eastern Anatolia. They were known as Danishmend, presumably because they themselves were learned, but also cultivated learning. And there are some theories that the original rulers of Danishmendis were actually Armenian converts to Islam. Followed by the second set work, and many others, by Kamil al-Ta'bir, the perfecter of dream interpretation, literally, is a work on dream interpretation written by a certain al-Tiflisi. So this one is a person who was born in Tbilisi, basically, Tbilisi, and from Georgia, a certain Abul Fazl Hubeish, dedicated to the Seljuk ruler, the second, Kılıç Arslan II. And this Hubeish also wrote several other works of secular learning in Persian, basically during the and here is one, essentially, this is the colophon of the Kitab Wujuh al-Quran, a specialized work on Quran by the same Hubeish. He also wrote work on Persian rhetoric and medicine. So he's a polymath, quite clearly, writing on astronomy, medicine, Quran, and also Persian literature at the same time in this century in Anatolia. Continuing with Seljuk examples, famous poets patronized by Anatolian rulers during the 12th century include household names. The most famous of Persian poets during the 12th century, Nizami of Genge, and Khagani, who is also from the area, southern Caucasus, Shirvan, both dedicated works to actually rulers of Anatolia as some of their works. And for Nizami, it's the Makhzenul Asrar that has been dedicated to an Anatolian ruler, and Khagani has several long odes dedicated to, again, Seljuk rulers. Perhaps the most famous sojourner who came into the land but left it is Shahabuddin Suhrawardi, the martyr, al-Maqtul, who spent most of his time in Aleppo, actually, but he did come into Anatolia and possibly dedicated one of his Persian works, Pertovname, to a Seljuk ruler. And of course, there are the most famous emigres of the 13th century. The one that everyone knows, Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, whose name Rumi basically comes from the fact that he lived in Anatolia at the time, which was known in Arabic and Persian, and increasingly in Turkish as Rum, literally Rome, of course, but referred to former territories of the Byzantine Empire, now ruled over by Seljuks. So Rumi is essentially someone who is from Rum, from Anatolia, and he, of course, and his family, after going through at least 5 different towns, ended up in Konya and actually lived there until his death. But he's not the only one. Other famous poets, Fakhreddin Iraqi, clearly one of the top lyric poets in Persian of all ages, essentially. Ohad-ed-Din Kirmani, who is close in terms of especially his quatrains. Switching over to Sufi figures who wrote in Persian, Najmeddin Razi, he's also known as Najmedaye, the wet nurse. That was his title, who wrote his major work, Mirsadul Ibad, the God's Bondsman, available in English translation by Hamid Algar, in Anatolia and dedicated to an Anatolian Seljuk ruler. And then we've got Sadeddin Qunavi and Saideddin al-Farghani, both disciples of the Muslim mystic Ibn al-Arabi, who cultivated his learning and also are responsible for essentially translating Ibn al-Arabian mysticism into Persian from the very beginning. And all this is happening in Anatolia. And Qutb-ed-Din Shirazi, a famous commentator on Suhrawardi, Shahabuddin Suhrawardi's works, but himself a major astronomer and polymath who is well known for his works. Again, all Anatolian figures from this period. And then there are others who are less known to Persian speakers, primarily because they wrote histories of Anatolia only, which become sidelined in later Persian history. Ibn Bibi, Mahmud Aksarai, and there are some others that I could add. Moving quickly on to the Turkmen era of the 14th and 15th centuries. Again, to remind you, this is a time period of 20 to 30 different polities of various size and duration based on one or more major cities, including major states of the 14th century like the Akkoyunlu, the dynasty of the white sheep, and the Karakoyunlu, the dynasty of the black sheep, and the Karaman, which ruled over territories of present-day Konya and its south. These were major states of their time. We had very active political and cultural courtly life, all of which cultivated basically Persian alongside increasingly Turkish. Now, Persian is still the language of imperial and political prestige in this era. All the political courts in major towns in Anatolia cultivate Persian learning, Persian belles-lettres, Persian writing of all kinds, and they also continue to patronize cultural elites who are Persian-oriented. In their courts, you will more readily find essentially polymaths, learned scholars, artists, writers, poets from the Persian East rather than the Arab South, generally speaking, which is an interesting phenomenon given the fact, the porous nature of the Turkish-Arab cultural borders as well. From the several sources from the 14th and especially the 14th century, we get the idea that Persian was generally thought to be easier than Arabic for the people of this land, the people of Rum. Primarily, this is the justification offered in the prefaces of many works where authors are writing in Persian and they are saying, I would have composed this in Arabic, but the people of this land find it difficult to understand, so I'm writing it in the beautiful and easy Persian. And so that's the way it crops up. But Turkish is on the rise as a language of refinement and high culture in this era. And this is the era, 14th and 15th centuries, which is probably the high era of translation from Persian into Turkish. We've got any kind of work that you could imagine in Persian is being translated for oftentimes political elites at the courts by, again, people whom they're patronizing as translators. And continuing on with a couple other examples from the Turkman principalities. For instance, in 1323, a commentary in Arabic written on the dense but extremely beautiful poetry of the Arab poet Ibn al-Farid, which is one of the zeniths of mystical Arabic poetry, had to be explained in Persian to madrasa students in Antalya in the south, today a favorite resort town of Iranians, especially and Russians, obviously, in southern Turkey. Or Jamaluddin Aksarai, who was active in Aksaray, who was actually a fourth-generation grandson of the great Muslim scholar of Iran, Fakhreddin Razi from Ray. He again wrote in Persian instead of in Arabic, so that people of Amasya, the town that he lived in the north of the peninsula, could understand it easily. So a fourth-generation Persian scholar clearly knows Arabic and also speaks Turkish. We know that for sure. He also, but writes in Persian, just to demonstrate the continuity of the cultivation of Persian across this territory. And then in the same period, various Arabic-Persian translations, as I already told you, took place for this reason. Moving on to the Ottoman Empire now. Very quickly, we're looking at a long period here. Ottoman Turkish towards the end of the 16th, start with the 15th century, towards the end of the 15th century begins to rise as the language of learning, and it becomes the undisputed language of politics, culture, as well as secular and even religious learning by the 17th century. So the 15th and 16th centuries are periods of transition for the rise of Ottoman Turkish, but come the 17th century, Ottoman Turkish reigns supreme now in all areas for the most part. This is the general reality. So in the Ottoman period, there are no significant numbers of Persian speakers are left in the Ottoman lands. This is not to say that there aren't significant enclaves of Persian speakers, but not enough to make a demographic reality, as far as we could tell. But there are still many elite emigres and travelers in search of employment and fame, and especially during the 16th century, when again the establishment of the Safavid empire and the imposition of Twelver Shi'ism as the official religion of the empire drove out many Sunni Iranian scholars and cultural elites out of Iran, either towards South Asia or to west to Anatolia, where we have again a similar phenomenon of waves of, if you will, immigration from within Iran to other lands. And Ottomans get their fair share, and in fact probably more than their fair share of such. Persian retains its cultural prestige in this Ottoman period, especially in poetry, which you would expect, in history writing. The 15th and 16th century, the Ottoman courts, eventually in mid-16th century, employ a court historian who is known in Ottoman as Shehnameci. Why? Because he writes the Shahnameh for the Ottomans. And in Persian. It's in the later half of the 16th century that the transition is completed to Ottoman Turkish. It starts already in the early 16th century when historians are writing in Ottoman Turkish, but Persian is still the history of literature, history writing for Ottoman sultans into the 16th century, changes around there. Letter writing, so this is epistolary, the art of highly flourished letter writing. So when Ottomans and Safavids communicate with one another, the Ottoman chancellor in the Ottoman court, for instance, at the beginning of the 16th century, when soon after there are battles between these two states, they're exchanging letters, the Ottoman chancellor actually writes and impresses his counterparts in Iran in beautiful Persian. Of course, not to say anything about the calligraphy, which is assumed, essentially. And then Sufi piety. The link between Persian and Sufi piety is never going to be severed totally for those Turkish-speaking Muslims who cultivate Sufi piety. Some will excel in it, others will simply dream of learning Persian one day, but that link is always going to be there. In this period, many manuscripts, in Persian obviously, prepared for the Mongol rulers of Iran, Ilkhanids, who basically disintegrate after the first quarter of the 14th century, the Akkoyunluds, the various Timurid dynasties that rule over Iran in the wake of Timur's conquests at the end of the 14th century and beginning of the 15th century. And then the Safavids, many of these manuscripts end up in especially libraries in Istanbul, but also elsewhere in Anatolia. So in terms of the Persian book, you should constantly be thinking, obviously, of all these different actors, especially cultural elites, always either writing books or bringing along books, because books are luxury items of high cultural prestige, generally speaking, for all of the actors. Some Ottoman examples, and then I think we'll be growing up quickly. Adni is the pen name of Mahmud Pasha, a southern Slav by origin, perhaps Bosnian or Croatian, who was the vizier of Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople. At least 2 works in Persian are known to have been dedicated to him. Tuhfat al-Mahmudiyya fi Nasihat al-Wuzara, clearly a work of administration by a certain Hiravi, someone coming from Herat. A compendium of advice on exercising the office of the vizier, and Anwarul Ahdaq, the light rays of the pupils of the eye, of unknown content. I haven't seen it, but I guess it has to do with something to do with optometry, ophthalmology, something to do with the eye, by a certain person, Sheikh Ali ibn Muhammad, known curiously as Musannifek, the little composer in the little class. He had a really nice title. Mahmud Pasha himself has a divan that contains 45 ghazals in Persian and 21 separate verses, and some of his ghazals were written in imitation of Hafiz. So here is a high Ottoman statesman at the end of the 15th century cultivating Persian. Now, Mehmed II and Bayezid II, his son, were in communication with the top poet of their age, Persian poet Jami, who dedicated one of his works, Silsilat al-Zahab, to Bayezid II. They tried to lure him to come to Istanbul. He wouldn't, but they clearly are following Persian poets and trying to attract them. Ottoman sultans themselves, most famously, are cultivating Persian as poets, and they typically write both in Turkish and in Persian. So Prince Cem, a famous figure, Selim I, who bested Shah Ismail in battle, Suleiman the Magnificent, and his son, one of his sons, Prince Bayezid, and another late ruler of the 16th century, Murad III, and some in the 17th century that I didn't mention, all wrote Persian poetry, collected in divans. So this is not just occasional Persian poetry. They have complete divans in Persian. And all of these are still extant for us today. Another example of a very influential figure, Fuzuli of Iraq. This is where we have a nexus of Arabic, Persian, and Turkish speakers in the area Mosul and around. He was a trilingual poet who composed in Arabic, Persian, and Turkish, and excelled in all 3 of them. He had, of his at least 15 works, of some 6 are in Persian. And look at his vagaries. He was first patronized by Shah Ismail. He was a Shiite, Fuzuli himself. And then he was patronized after the conquest of Baghdad by the Ottomans, by the Ottoman Chancellor Celalzade Mustafa, the same guy who wrote in beautiful Persian letters, and by the Ottoman Prince Bayezid. This is just to show you the richness, the cultural richness of this area. A Bosnian figure, Ahmet Sudi, born in Bosnia, educated in Sarajevo, by that time an Ottoman territory, obviously, and Istanbul, and later in South Anatolia, in an area which is now the heartland of Kurds and Kurdish speakers in Turkey, Diyarbakir. He was a student of an Iranian scholar, Muslihuddin Lari, who was himself a protege of the Mughal ruler Humayun for a period. He became a mudarris, a professor at the madrasa in Istanbul, and he is the author of authoritative commentaries in Turkish on the principal Persian classics, the Masnavi of Rumi, the Bustan and Gulistan of Sa'di, and the Divan of Hafiz. And his commentaries on Sa'di and Hafiz are to this day considered to be among the top few commentaries, either in Persian or Turkish. Of course, these are available in Persian translation. They have long been translated into Persian because they're philologically and in other ways unsurpassed in terms of his learning. This is just to demonstrate what's going on. Another Persian cultivator from Bosnia, Fevzi, 18th century, he taught Persian and the Masnavi of Rumi at a house dedicated to the Masnavi, Darul Masnavi, in Mostar, Bosnia, which was an institute for the study of the Masnavi, where, quote, a host of the silver-faced would come to his room to learn from him the sugar of the Persian tongue. He himself was the author of a work called the Bulbulistan, the Nightingale Garden, The only prose work in Persian produced by a Bosnian author, so far as we know, modeled on Sa'di's Bustan. You should know that the Bulbulistan included a chapter dealing with biographies of Bosnian and other Ottoman poets who wrote in Persian. So this is a chapter that is found out. Coming to the Republic, with the net result of all of this basically is that there are lots of Persian books in Turkey. An initial reckoning, first of all, Turkey is probably the richest nation state in terms of Islamic manuscripts worldwide. We have at least 250,000 documented. Unconfirmed estimates would probably take that twofold if you take into account all the Persian manuscripts that are in private hands, in smaller libraries, and so on and so forth. But out of those 250,000, only about 15% of which are systematically catalogued so far. 160,000 are in Arabic, 70,000 are in Ottoman Turkish, and 13,000 in Persian. And just to give you a sense of the distribution of the Persian manuscripts in the major libraries, I put those figures there. Suleymaniye Library, the top Islamic manuscript library in the world, with about 70,000 manuscripts. Around 30, it's basically 3,544 Persian manuscripts there, followed by Istanbul University Library. You can see the figures there. Ankara Public Library, 1,300. Topkapı Palace, 940. Ankara University Library, 926. So if you want to go and see Persian manuscripts, some of the most exquisite ones available in the world today, these are the places that you could visit only in Istanbul and Ankara. And the 20th century sees quite a lot of scholarly attention to this rich history of Turkish and Persian intertwining, in particular the Persian book in Anatolia, from both Iranian and Turkish scholars. I give you some names: Mojtaba Minuvi, Amin Riahi, who has the distinction of being the author of the only book-length study of Persian manuscripts in Turkish language, in Persian. Tawhik Sobhani, indefatigable translator of things Turkish into Persian, and a scholar. And from the Turkish side, Abdülbaki Gölpınarlı, one of the top Sufism scholars of all times in any language, specifically Rumi, and specifically his order Mevlevis. Ahmet Ateş, an Orientalist trained by Helmut Ritter of Germany, who was active in Turkey and who was followed by Tahsin Yazıcı, another colleague of Ahmet Ateş. Both of them have been basically unsurpassed so far in terms of the attention they have given to Persian literature, Persian legacy of Persian learning in the Turkish lands, Turkish-speaking lands, broadly speaking. So there is a lot more to be done, but this gives you an idea that people are working at it. Summary. So if we go back to our fourfold schema that I started out with. So in the Seljuk and Turkmen eras, we have Persian spoken at the everyday level, but not later. When we look at Persian as the language of empire and political culture, we see that Seljuk and Turkmen and early Ottoman eras, Persian still is the dominant language of political culture, but fades away after the 16th century. If you look at Persian as the language of Islam, especially Sufism and secular learning, the same thing applies until the 17th century, but in Sufi Islam, especially in Mevlevi subjects, up until today, it continues. Today, there are still lots of private teachers of the Masnavi who actually go around and either expostulate or offer commentaries on the Masnavi, or teach Persian to those who are interested in learning Persian, just to be able to read the Masnavi, for instance. And if you look at the Persian language as language of literature, in particular poetry, again the same things apply, but among Ottoman literateurs and Ottoman devotees of literature, authors, poets, Persian always remains the second language to cultivate and follow. So whatever is happening in Iran, generally speaking, especially into the 18th century, is being followed by everyone. So very quickly, I have only one slide left. So leaving aside Arabic, Persian, the Turkish, what I've called the Persian-Turkish intertwining, quite likely is the most intense and long-lasting case of interaction and symbiosis between two linguistic and literary traditions in Islamic history. Perhaps next in line as a rival is Persian and South Asian languages, and Urdu when Urdu develops, especially from the 17th century onwards. How should this relationship be understood? How should it be theorized? And we are still struggling with this difficult question. Should we refer to cultural spheres? Some people have been referring to Turco-Persian cultural sphere. This applies to Central Asia as well as the areas that we look at. Of course, from the perspective of Persian, it's the Persianate world, and rightly so, because Persian has such a significant and singular role played in this sphere. Is it the world of Persian and Turkish, whatever that may mean? Should we assume multiculturalism, or going beyond that, should we even be talking of cosmopolitanism in its many senses? These are all difficult theoretical questions. I would venture to say that we should probably think of it at the very least as a cultural living together, cultural symbiosis. And it's a laboratory, this cultural symbiosis is a laboratory for the study of formation of different language registers, especially the specialized registers that we've been talking about, language as the language of politics, the language of religious or secular learning, language of literature. This is a phenomenon that's very important in history, which we have not yet been able to wrap our minds around satisfactorily. At the very least, then, we should be talking about linguistic and literary imbrication and intertwining. Multilingualism is a phenomenon that is ripe for study in this era, and of course translation studies. And finally, for those of us who again go back to a comment that I made, who have been cultivated and brought up in the era of nationalism, we should think of cultural identity in new and more challenging ways. If you're looking for a legacy to go back to, the Persian-Turkish intertwining is one that I would highly recommend to you. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I can take perhaps a couple questions.
We'll take about... Thank you, Dr. Karamustafa, for a very interesting talk. We would like to take about 5 or 6 questions, and I ask that you ask questions and not make long statements because we don't have that much time. Go ahead.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you so much for this very, very exciting presentation and very interesting presentation. I was interested in that process of the two languages and the translation from one to the other. How much borrowing occurred between the two? I mean, how many words came from Turkish into the Persian language? How many words from Persian got into the Turkish language, and what types of words were borrowed, in that symbiosis relationship? Because that happens when languages are close.
Yes, so it is obviously difficult to quantify, but I can tell you that in response, for instance, that there is a 4-volume dictionary of Turkish words in Persian, written by a German scholar, Gerhard Dörfer. We don't have a similar one necessarily for Persian into Ottoman Turkish. As far as I know, most Ottoman Turkish dictionaries include so many Persian words that if anyone sat down and counted, I would think that the percentage would be quite high, quite clearly. But leaving aside the quantitative side of the story, I think no one doubts, anyone who actually knows something about the histories of both of these languages and the literary traditions, that there has been significant interaction and therefore loan words from one into the other. The question, of course, is what do we do about that next? What's the significance of that? It has become...
I mean, was it, for example, did the Persian borrow terms which were in the administration, the political terms from Turkey? Did Turkey borrow literary terms from Persia? I mean, was there a particular area or field in which the borrowing took place?
Yes, I would speculate and say that since I singled out those particular registers of language for Persian in terms of the language of politics, political culture, language of literature, and language of Sufi learning in particular, but Islamic religious learning, I would single those areas out for Persian into Turkish. Thinking the other way around, it will be much more difficult for me to generalize at this stage, in other words, from Turkish into Persian. I would expect, again, quite a lot of political, cultural issues will be there, and cultural terms that have to do with basically the tribal lives of Turkic nomads inhabiting the Iranian plateau for several, long centuries, essentially, ultimately going in, plus some other terms probably afterwards. But it's an intriguing question. I would say that it is so difficult because you have to work from to use the technical term lexicon of both these languages and then try to reach some generalizations about culture, which is not really very easy to do. But
Go ahead.
Two things. One, I think the title that you mentioned, Kashful Aqaba, it could be that this is an astronomical term or astrological term, but Aqaba also refers to difficulties.
it's a difficult mountain road, actually.
So,
That's
yeah,
what it
so
means. I looked it up.
So it could be answers to difficulties.
Yes, it could definitely be that.
But I wanted to make a quick comment on the language exchange. Because Turkish is so loyal to vowel harmony, in that, certain vowels follow certain other vowels, identifying non-Turkic words are fairly easy. And in fact, when you study Turkish as a new language, that's one way of trying to understand, but you can immediately tell this is not a Turkish word, or this is being changed to become more similar to the harmonized version in Turkish. So I'm just wondering if there is any study of the way Turkish absorbs these other languages that you know.
Well, no, I'm not a linguistic historian, and that would have to be a linguistic historical question. I would say that, of course, that's not always the case. Turks do take foreign words and make the vowels harmonize, and they change them. So, a good example, the word Sufi has become in Turkish, in the Ottoman period, sofu, which is a good Turkish word. It has a negative connotation because it applies to those who put on an air of being learned and so on and so forth. So it's not always a good guide, but for those who know, let's say, both Persian and Turkish, it's not a difficult thing at all to figure out which one is Persian and which one is Turkish. I would say the difficulty I referred to is mostly in moving from a quantitative or even not qualitative linguistic analysis to cultural generalizations. That's going to be much more tricky, I think, in that sense. That needs to be done in historical context.
Follow up on what Mary Jane asked earlier. We keep hearing the role of Arabic, and obviously there's a large number of Arabic books. I'm curious I know the focus on this and the exhibition and everything has been the Persian book and the influence of Persian. But in this case, if you were to interweave Arabic into this narrative, where does it go in if you were to do it in a very quick if it's possible? How would you weave in Arabic? Because it's obviously there and it plays a role in both languages. So.
Yes, so you want me to give a talk in 1 minute?
Yeah.
Okay. Which I will do and say that Arabic basically continues to, throughout this period, to be the language specialized Muslim or Islamic learning in especially areas that are designated as religious sciences. So it's Quran interpretation, Hadith studies, Islamic law, Islamic theology, these four in particular, not to mention the study of Arabic language and poetry itself, which is of course needed for this, and the early history of Islam, so the Prophet Muhammad and his companions and so on and so forth. These are constantly basically maintained and cultivated in Arabic throughout this whole period, essentially. And so that's definitely where Arabic fits. And to open a parenthesis, the other part where Arabic fits is after the acquisition or the conquest of Arabic-speaking lands by the Ottomans from after 1516 and 1517, then, of course, Arabic and Turkish begin to interact in ways that surpass, in terms of intensity, porousness and all that, what had come before. So to the extent that the Turkish presence and the Turkish-Arabic interaction is readily visible today from Lebanon down to Egypt to even Libya, I would say, for the most part, in terms of everyday language usage, Effendi and all that sort of stuff. Clearly, we have that over the past 4 centuries or so, or 5 centuries or so.
But wouldn't you say the early Persian that influenced the Seljuks and what have you had already incorporated a big Arabic repertoire?
In terms of, if you're asking this as in terms of original, the origins of certain words, well, that's certainly the case, but that's not what I normally would refer to, because when I refer to Persian, you refer to Persian as it is spoken and as it is written, irrespective of where all those words come from. So that's quite clearly the case. Yes.
I'm sorry. Any other questions? Go ahead.
Can you say just a little bit about the way Persian is taught in present-day Turkey, the nation, the country of Turkey? Because I know that, we had a visiting scholar last year from Turkey who spoke Persian fluently and all that. So I wonder if there is anything.
Well, as someone who holds Persian dear to his heart, which I am rather not very happy with the state of affairs. At last, it's not bad, but it should be much, much better. At the academic level, at last count, I found Persian language and literature departments at 7 Turkish universities, with faculty of about 5 to 8 or so. And at the non-academic level, there is much more that goes on, for sure. It's very difficult to document. My general sense has been that the cultivation of Persian in the country, broadly speaking, has been at higher levels in the central and eastern Anatolia than in western Anatolia, not surprisingly so. Perhaps higher among Kurdish speakers to a certain extent, because, again, they tended to be more in the east up until the last couple of decades or so. That's no longer the case. By the way, Turkish demography has changed dramatically. So a lot is happening in informal, private settings. But it's difficult to document that. Let me just add to say that after, of course, the revolution in Iran, 79 revolution, but more particularly over the past couple decades, in the 90s and 2000s, the number of actual Persian speakers, emigres from Iran, presumably has also gone up. This is something that you can feel at an impressionistic level. The impact that they are having and are going to have in the teaching of Persian, and perhaps, again, another level of injection of Persian into Turkish society, yet remains to be seen. But this is something that we should not underestimate. I would say that we are again seeing a bilingual generation basically, in Turkey, who might then turn into excellent scholars of Persian and Turkish intertwining over time. And then there is some crossover of students coming from Iran to Turkey and Turkey to vice versa. For instance, someone in a Turkish university wrote to me and said, dear professor in beautiful Turkish, he was Iranian, I'm studying Sufism, what topic would you suggest during the 13th century? I said, Ohededdin Kirmani has not been studied all that well. He took it up, wrote a dissertation, is about to finish, and is back in Iran teaching at Zanjan, I think. And then many Turkish students have done PhDs, especially Tehran University, on topics, oftentimes Persian, but yet cultivated in Anatolia. And hopefully there will be more of those to actually look more into this legacy. Any amount of Persian learning that goes on in Turkey would make me tremendously happy. But so that's the short answer to your question.
Any other questions? The family.
Thank you very much for such wonderful talk. I would like to learn more about the relationship between the Persian book and the Arabian Nights. Especially they came around the same period, very close to the end of the Sayyid period. In the Arabian Nights, we began to have like some kind of popular culture about the history of Persian, Sasanian, especially Sasanian kings in the beginning of the Arabian Nights. And I think both of them are like kind of fruit of the Sayyid period and the position of Persian culture in the Sayyid period.
Well, if I may, if I could try and answer your question this way. The Arabian Nights, which really surface in written manuscripts from the 14th century or so onwards, reflects a level of popular culture that we also see in Persian, starting again from the 12th century or so onwards, but surfacing in writing again at around the 14th and 15th centuries, and in Turkish. So at the level of popular culture, we've got, like Arabian Nights, not only tales, but also popular epics, both in Persian and later in Turkish as well, some of which are incidentally composed in Anatolia, like Darabname, which is a famous Persian epic, was written by someone who hailed from Tarsus in southern Turkey, the birthplace of St. Paul. And he is the author of the Persian Darabname, broadly speaking. So clearly already from the 8th century of the Common Era, we've got Arabic-Persian intertwining. But added to that, from the 10th century onwards, we've got the Turkish component. And at a popular level, this translates into popular epics that are and tales that are basically orally transmitted for centuries, and then also committed to writing. At that level, there is a complete, I think, a porousness of Arabic, Persian, to go back to your question, but also into Turkish. I mean, I take particular interest in these popular epics myself, so it's good that you asked. But there are, in Arabic, we've got all these Sira literatures that are devoted to Arab heroes, either pre-Islamic or Islamic. Some of them actually 13th century figures like Baybars, the Mamluk ruler. And these kinds of epics actually incorporate so much of the Middle Eastern culture, broadly speaking, that at that point it becomes difficult to draw the line and say, this is Arabic and this is Persian and this is Persian. So it's a very rich area, and I would say that the impact of the Persian storytelling tradition and poetry has been tremendous on Arabic as well as Turkish, clearly.
Any more questions? Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming.
Thank you for listening.
Wonderful program. And we have another.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.